Awesome to be here. 10 years ago, this summer, you wrote a piece in The Atlantic called "Why Can't Women Still Have It All?" Anybody remember that? Yeah? It got a little buzz, just a little, largely because it was an indictment of women's progress. I mean, if Anne Marie Slaughter couldn't have it all, where would that leave the rest of us? What I found remarkable about the piece was that here was this woman with so much public power expressing such vulnerability publicly. You were sharing that you were finding it extremely difficult to fulfill your role professionally, your role personally in your home. And that was something that, especially at that time, good women leaders didn't do. How do you feel like the workplace, how do you feel like our society has evolved to allow more of us to bring our full selves to the table, to be more vulnerable and honest in telling our stories so that we can advance more women?
Well, thanks, Tiffany. And it's such a pleasure to be here. It's also incredible. It's so hard to realize it was 10 years ago that I wrote that article. And it did. It created a kind of tsunami that certainly changed my life, and I think helped rekindle a whole debate about what it's going to take to get to gender equality. On the one hand, I think the vulnerability part, and you're right. I mean, I didn't expect the article to have that impact, but I did know that if I was willing to tell my own story as a successful woman, it would have more of an impact. But that vulnerability, I think now we are much more comfortable. I was watching the earlier panel on mental illness, right? You would not have had a panel 10 years ago where people are willing to talk much more openly about depression, about being neuroatypical, about any of the things I think now that we are more willing to bring to the fore. And I do think that's important. The other thing, though, that has really changed, and again, you saw it here this morning, we now talk about care. We don't just talk about work-family balance, and most of us know it's not a balance, but that's the way it was talked about, or women's issues, right? These things that we're supposed to be just like men, even though we know that this is incredibly hard. We talked about it in terms of the workplace. Now we talk about care and the need to make room for care. And that, as you saw the entrepreneurs this morning talking about the care economy, talking about care infrastructure, that's really changed.
There are some parts of your core argument that I think you got right and that have endured. Certainly, the inability of a woman to advance in her career because of her caregiving responsibilities, no one would perceive as a personal failure at this point. That would feel unjust.
Yes.
There was another part of your argument that I would love for you to expand on that I also think you got right, which is that this issue is just as much about the trajectory of women's careers, which we're really seeing now given the pandemic, as it is the quality of the workplace itself. Can you talk a little bit more about
Absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. And I will say on your first point, this idea that it's up to the woman rather than the system. I mean, at the time, it was 10 years ago this month, I was on the front page of the New York Times, juxtaposed with Sheryl Sandberg. It was lean in versus lean out. It was women can have it all, women can't. I actually hate the whole frame of women or anybody having it all. Having enough is what we should focus on, and we should focus on those who don't have enough. But that was dramatically overplayed. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg did think, women should lean in, but she would then, and certainly now, recognize that we need systemic change. And I certainly think that there's lots of things women need to do to put ourselves forward, but I think that's just a small part of the story. So I do think we've moved past that. We recognize the need for systemic change. The other piece, though, is that we still have workplaces, careers, life expectations designed for a time when men who had full-time caregivers at home worked until they were 65, retired, and had maybe 10 more years life expectancy. Our children should live till they're 100. Right? We are cramming life into the first sort of half, maybe even less of our expected years. And I'm now over 60, and I mean, who knows what could happen any day, but I have lots of energy. Indeed, we know that human beings thrive as a species in part because of older women, right? It's the grandmother hypothesis. Why do human women live so much longer than their reproductive lives? And the answer is because they help care for their daughters' children, and they transmit cultural lessons and knowledge. That's who we are as a species. Our notion of a career basically says, well, after 65, you're done. That is nuts. We should be thinking about those periods of your lives where you're really investing in yourself and your career, those periods of your lives where you're investing in your children or your other family members, and those periods of your lives where then you're also investing in caring for other older family members. I'm now in that phase of my life. All of that is compatible with other periods where you can go really hard on something that you're passionate about, and you can keep doing that. You just heard about learning lifelong. For every decade, you can think about new projects. We need to adapt our workplaces and our notions of career to the rhythms of human caregiving and investment in ourselves, and redesign not just our workplaces, but our notion of what a career is to fit that.
For sure, redesign. Just like there were parts of your argument that have endured, one of the things that I really respect about you, Anne-Marie, is that you also are willing to admit what you might have gotten wrong. And you've been very forthcoming about some of your blind spots. Can you talk about what you feel like, looking back in hindsight and given your learnings, what we need to do to move forward?
Oh. How long do we have? Not long enough.
9 minutes and 43 seconds.
9 minutes and 41 seconds
Yes.
at this point, yes. So the first thing to say is, I had been a foreign policy expert all my life, right? I was not known as a feminist. I never took a women's studies class. And I write this article, and I start going cross-country and giving talks. And I would talk about feminism and, how women had been stuck at home and wanted to get into the workplace, and, my notion of what second-wave feminism was. And every time someone would raise their hand and say, well, I'm a woman of color. My mother, my grandmother's grandmother always worked. I don't know where this story of, sitting in the suburbs in your fancy house, wanting to go to work and then hiring other women to care for your children, that is not my experience. Or for that matter, women who came from working families who said, my mother always had to work. So I truly was blind to something that seems incredible 10 years on, because all of our consciousness has been raised. But I didn't know to talk about feminisms, right? I didn't know about the Combahee River statement of Black feminism in the late 1970s that is so powerful, not just about gender equality, but about justice and about how we think about what different women need. And I do think now, here we are, we're talking about embracing ambition, where women and men, I can see, from all different places. There is no feminism. There's no one feminism. I remember when Michelle Obama said she wanted to be mom-in-chief, and many kind of feminist voices were really quite appalled. Oh my God, here you are, you're first lady, you want to be mom-in-chief? I would say, absolutely, right? Let's embrace our ambition. Let's embrace our ambition to be the individual we can be, to have the careers we hope we can choose, but equally to be the caregivers, to be there for our families, and to understand that particularly if the women in your family have worked to take care of other women's children, absolutely you'd want to be able to be there for your children, and that's just as noble in ambition and as important to gender equality as this very narrow sort of vision of what was white, affluent, suburban feminism.
Let's talk about broadening. Yes. Let's talk about broadening that a bit. I, several years ago, was in Iceland speaking at a conference. Iceland, for those of you who don't know, has been ranked #1 by the World Economic Forum in gender equality for, I think, 12 years straight. So those women in Iceland know what they're doing. And I asked a high-ranking official what advice she had for women in the United States about advancing gender equality, given that Iceland was #1. And I'll never forget what she said. She lamented that, unfortunately, women in America don't have the one thing that you need in order to advance gender equality: solidarity. You need solidarity. And one of the things
Very important.
that you've been very focused on is recognizing and addressing the tension that we've had in the movement, specifically around race, which I really believe part of the source of is not opening the aperture for feminism in the way that you're describing. We fail to understand sometimes that just like all politics is local, all feminism is personal. Whatever you're dealing with in your day-to-day as a woman is feminism to you. If you are a mother who is risking your child's life to try to get over the border, immigration is a feminist issue to you.
Exactly.
It's not just reproductive rights, while we need reproductive rights, my goodness. It's not just pay equity, though we need pay equity. It's not just sexual harassment. And I believe that actually opening the aperture for what feminism means and what it is a really important part of us addressing that tension. What do you feel like we need to do in order to create or move towards the solidarity that we need?
You know, I love this question. I think it's so important, and it's not a word we hear very often, right? I mean, solidarity is not particularly in the American DNA, and I'll come back to that. But I do think the first way of thinking about that is solidarity among women, exactly, and understanding that what a woman wants is something we should support. What a man wants, hopefully we will get to the point where this is human beings. But as we're thinking about gender equity, we've had, the wars between stay-at-home moms versus working moms, as opposed to, you and I were talking last night, a way in which people who can help pick up your kids can be there. You can bring things, to the school fund drive if you have financial skills in a way that truly is looking at individual women and groups of women in terms of what they need. So there's part of it that really, I agree that we think about care feminism and career feminism and all those tensions, and they're bigger if you think about across the country, about women feeling not valued because they don't fit a particular, they're not at the top of a career, they're staying home. So there's solidarity there, I think, among women that is absolutely vital. But there's an even bigger way of opening that aperture, which is, I look out at this audience, and I see lots of lights, but no, I can see you. But I've been noticing this all day. This audience reflects the country we are becoming. You are. You are the new America, right? We are becoming a country that will not have a white majority. We will be a plurality nation, which is an extraordinary transformation for a country that was a dominant white majority for 250 years, for 400 years, since Europeans landed on this soil and conquered it. Traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism is very individualist. And we have a society that is highly individualist. That's the biggest difference with Iceland, right? There is not this notion that individuals are responsible for their own destiny. And even innovation, you just heard this from Temple Grandin. Yes, there's the Einstein genius, the Steve Jobs genius. An awful lot of innovation happens in teams, people supporting one another. But as we become the pluralist nation we're becoming, think about African American traditions, Indian American traditions, Chinese American or Asian American broadly traditions, Indigenous American traditions. These are almost all more family-oriented, more solidarity-oriented. You know, for the white pioneers were headed across the Great Plains in a wagon train, although even then they had the whole train to support them. For African Americans, that wasn't an east to west journey. That was a south to north journey, and it was the Underground Railroad. And that is a story of social solidarity, of supporting one another. That's where we need to go as a country, not just for gender equity, but to be the country we can be, to be both individualists and solidaristic, both care and career, both connecting as human beings and competing. That's what whole human beings are about. That's what women are about. We have a choice, we care, we compete, we connect. It's also what men are about, right? We need to create that space for them as well. So I'll say, 10 years on, I look back, I focus now on care every bit as much as career. I think we need to bring them together. I think we need a whole infrastructure of care. But more broadly, we need the conversation you and I are having. And we need that conversation even when it's uncomfortable.
That's
right?
it. That's it. We need the conversation, but we also need the action. And I want to thank you so much for the solidarity that you have displayed, not just in your movement building, but in the everyday yeses that you give and what you do. Anne-Marie has been very supportive of me in my career. So she doesn't just talk about all of this, she actually does all of this. Thank you for being a part of my crew. And thank you so much for your work and your leadership. We're all the better for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.